Now, obviously, as teachers, we want our learners to improve, and that means addressing some of their language errors. But I find this can make them feel a bit demotivated. And we know it's a part of learning, but perhaps our students actually see it as a sign of failure. And it's tricky actually to strike that balance, isn't it, Abby?
It really is. We know that, making mistakes is all part of the process and it's a good thing and we can learn from it. But yeah, it's important to realise that our students don't necessarily see it that way.
Absolutely.
I'm Abby.
I'm Charlotte.
And you're listening to a My World of ELT podcast. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about our own experiences of encouraging our learners to see those errors as learning opportunities rather than problems. So, Charlotte, do you remember being a language learner yourself and how you felt about making mistakes?
Yeah, I think I sort of had mixed feelings about it because I was a language learner before I was a teacher, and I was also a lot younger. And I didn't mind making a mistake once, but after that, just got embarrassed really quickly because I just really felt like, oh, I've been told I've got it wrong once and I know it's wrong, and why do I keep doing this? And oh, it's not working out and I'm failing at this, and why can't I get it right? And it became quite frustrating. So that was my sort of feelings when I was a language learner. But actually now that I'm, a bit more experienced with my teaching and a bit older, there's lots of things I would do differently. I think I would actually take the advice that I give my students, which is have a go, keep going, try again, don't be disheartened. Making mistakes is all part of the process.
If only we could have had a chat with our future selves when we were back at that age, making mistakes.
It's so true.
I think exactly the same as you. All of my language learning experience happened before I got into teaching myself. So at school, learning, French and German. And I think the thing about errors there as well was that we were in a class with about 28 other people. So you felt pretty exposed if you made a mistake in front of your peers. And then I remember learning Portuguese when I was living there. And actually, I was really paranoid about making mistakes. So I would not have a go as much. I'd hold myself back, and I'd rather not say anything than say something and get it wrong. So I limited what I would say and the interactions that I would have. And it's such a shame now when I look back and I think, oh, if I'd have been a language teacher before I started learning those languages, I'd have done it in a very different way, or at least had a very different attitude towards it.
Yeah.
So in your experience, what are some students' different attitudes towards making mistakes?
Well, I think a lot of students I come across feel the same way that I used to feel about making mistakes. I don't meet many students who are completely okay about it. I think most students feel a little bit embarrassed, or a bit like yourself when you were learning, you worry about it and you feel exposed, and so you don't want to do it. So then you kind of limit yourself. And other students, they will just wait and wait and wait to produce something. And it's such a pity, because if you start doing it from the beginning, you just learn so much more quickly. But I think a lot of it is also personality. There are certain students who are just like, yeah, I will give it a go. And, oh God, I've got it wrong. Oh, well, never mind, I'll try again. But in my experience, those students are kind of few and far between.
Yeah.
But what about you? What about your experience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess when we're in the context of teaching adult learners, so where we have had at the school students come over from lots of different countries, lots of different educational systems, lots of different learning experiences, I think they're all completely shaped by what came before. So if they had a really bad experience of a strict teacher that made them feel rubbish every time they made a mistake, they've brought that baggage with them to this learning experience. And then similarly, if there's a student who's been quite lucky and had a teacher that's been really supportive and encourages them to have a go, and it doesn't matter if they make mistakes, they're probably more likely to get involved and have that attitude where, this is all part of it. It's fine. I don't care. Um, so I think you're quite right. Personality and also experience. I think previous experience can have a massive impact on students' feelings and attitudes towards errors. So, what impact do you think these different attitudes have on their approach to learning in that case?
I think a fair amount of students rely more on their teacher because they're kind of scared of making mistakes or they don't want to make those mistakes. So they will just sort of rely on their teacher to guide them and to do all of the talking. And they want to do a lot of listening, and they want to see a lot of models, and they want to see a lot of examples again and again and again, and hear it again and again and again before they even attempt to produce it, either speaking or in writing. So that's something that I've come across fairly regularly. What about you? Have you noticed anything?
Yeah, I think, as you've said, it is that kind of, there's that diagram, I forget where it's from, where it shows different learning approaches to swimming. And there's the one that wants to read all the books
Yes.
about swimming before they dive in. And then
Is
there's
that Honey
one
and
where they,
Lemon?
yeah, you're right. Yes, it is. And then there's one where they just dive in and learn from it. And that's a really nice visual representation, actually,
Yeah.
of different approaches to learning. And I guess there are some people that are so anxious about making mistakes that they want to know everything there is to know about it before they even try. Whereas others understand that, this is the only way I am going to learn is by giving
Yeah.
it a go and seeing how it turns out.
So, Abby, do you think it's possible to change our learners' feelings around making mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think so. I guess there are some students that if it is more about their personality rather than previous experience, maybe it's a little bit harder to change their attitude towards making mistakes and to see it in a more positive light. But if it is down to experience, if they've had a negative experience of making mistakes and then being pointed out in a not particularly subtle way, um, or a supportive way, I guess you need to change their reference point. You need to demonstrate that it can be a really valuable part of the whole process. And
Yeah.
particularly, I think if the students are given the opportunity to get it right, I think when a student gets something wrong and that's corrected for them or highlighted to them, they're left with that feeling of, oh, I got that wrong and I've been
Mm,
put right. I've been told what it should have been. But if they're involved in that whole process of, oh, have another go, think about this. What about that verb form? Remember something we studied? Have another go, have a little think, look at your notes. If they're involved in that whole correction process, then I think they have that little celebratory moment at the end when they get it right. And that's what they go away remembering rather
absolutely.
than the getting it wrong.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of encouraging, supportive, autonomous approach to error correction. I think that can hopefully encourage students to feel a little bit more positive about the mistake, and so that it doesn't actually end up becoming a thing.
Yeah.
It's blended into the whole lesson rather than, there was that awkward moment where I made a mistake and everybody found out kind of thing. I,
Yeah.
I think the other thing is reminding learners that we made plenty of mistakes when we were learning our first language.
Mm,
You don't suddenly start speaking your first language entirely accurately. You play around with it, you have a go, and you think of young, learners, young children rather,
yeah.
starting to get to grips with their first language, and they make those little mistakes because they're noticing patterns and they're trying things and getting it wrong. And we don't question that. We don't ridicule children or make them feel bad, or but it's
No.
just accepted. And yeah, so I think that can be a good reminder.
Yeah, it's just accepted, isn't it, as part of the learning experience and part of getting better and improving and learning. And I think what you said is so right about being in a classroom where it does become part of the learning journey. It's not being singled out. It's not like, oh dear, you've got it wrong. That's embarrassing. If you can encompass it as part of your lesson and part of your learning journey, and it's becomes student centered, everyone gets involved, And this is just part of your classroom culture. And it's a really safe space where your students don't feel embarrassed about making mistakes, or they certainly feel less embarrassed than they would have done, because it's
Definitely.
kind of like, oh, we've all made this mistake, or this, I've heard this before, and let's talk about it, and let's
Yeah.
think about how we can correct that together. I think that's all part of creating a really nice safe space for your learners to make those errors.
Yeah. And I think not using language like, come on, this is easy, or you'll know
Absolutely,
this,
yeah.
because I think although we may not think too much about what we're saying in those situations, we might think it's a little prompt like, come on, we've studied this, you know this.
I've told you this before.
Yeah, for a learner, that can feel a little bit like they're, oh God, everyone else seems to know it, or I
Yeah,
should know it and I don't remember it. And so I think trying to avoid that assumption, or using language that makes students feel like it's assumed that they will know this and get it right as well.
agreed. And in your classroom, are there any particular activities that you've used to work on errors in a more constructive way?
Yeah, I love including error correction activities of some description, because I
Mhm.
think that can, we talked about making it part of the learning, part of that whole journey. And I think if you're including activities that focus on error correction, it feels a bit, it's a bit less exposed, I guess, rather than going, look at all these mistakes. It's right, but let's do a fun activity. Look at this sentence. What do you think? Is it right or is it wrong? And I think, a favorite is the grammar auction, where you get
Oh,
your
yeah.
students to do a speaking activity, and you're writing down some things that they're saying while they're doing it, but not just mistakes. You're also writing down some good language that you hear and good examples of the grammar or vocabulary that you may have been studying recently. And then at the end of the activity, I think the important thing is to make sure that there is feedback on the success of the activity itself
Yeah.
before you even talk about errors. So, what was the outcome? How did they get on? What did they get right? What did they do really well? What was their communication like? And then, almost as a follow up, say, okay, well, let's move on to a little activity. I've made a note of some things that you said, and, have a look. What do you think? Are they right or wrong? And of course, the auction side of things is where you give them a fictional amount of money, and they have to buy the phrases that they are most confident about, whether they're right or wrong, and they can double their money. There's all sorts of variations, but it just makes it fun and not,
Yeah.
oh, here we go, let's listen to all the things we got wrong.
That's such a popular activity in my classroom. It's never gone badly, that one.
No.
They've always loved it.
And in terms of prep for the teacher, it's great because you're just using what the students have given you in the speaking activity. So you don't have
Yeah.
to go away and plan a load of this stuff in advance. It's what you're hearing in the moment.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant, brilliant example of how you're focusing on error correction, but you've almost taken the focus off of it. And so
Yeah.
students they're not thinking, oh God, I made a mistake. It's like, oh my God, I want to win this.
Well, I think you make a good point there, because it's about the error and not about the person. I think quite
Mm,
often error correction is seen as the person. The person said something wrong. This person wrote this grammatically incorrect sentence. Whereas if you turn it into an activity and you're removing it from, you're not telling them who said this.
yeah,
It's not about the person. It's about how can we use this as a learning opportunity, and it's separating the student from the thing they said. And I
yeah,
think that's where you're removing some of that awkwardness and embarrassment, and you're making it like I say, a learning activity and not an opportunity to highlight someone's mistakes.
definitely.
There's also a really lovely activity. We'll have to put some references alongside this podcast
Yes,
for an
yes.
error correction maze, and I just love this activity. Where I think it's Bertrand and someone. I'll find out, and we'll put a link in with these activities. So the error correction maze is like a pre-prepared maze where you give them a speaking activity. While they're doing it, you're making a note of good things that have been said and some problematic language or some mistakes, some errors. And there's a code that the teacher has, and you've got a list of 14 sentences, and you know that some of them are going to be examples of good language, some are going to be examples where there was some little mistakes in there. So you write them down, you project them on the board or on the computer or whatever. And then students get this maze, and it's the same every time, so you don't have to prepare it yourself. And they look at the sentence, and if they think it's grammatically correct, they follow the black arrow. No, sorry, the white arrow. If they look at the sentence, they think it's incorrect, they follow the white arrow, and they have to find their way out of this maze. And I find that a really, really good activity, because if they go wrong and they can't get out of the maze, they have to go back and revisit it and go, right, where did we go wrong? Which sentence do we think perhaps we got wrong this time? So there's loads of peer work, loads of discussion. Yeah, and that is a really kind of in-depth activity. It's not like a quick 2 minutes at the end, let's have a quick chat.
Yeah.
That in itself is a really, really kind of positive learning experience, and it can be competitive, which works well as well.
And fun. Again, just bringing
Yeah.
that element, isn't it, of making it an enjoyable activity rather than a focus on something negative or something that could be seen as negative.
Yeah, sure.
And Abby, what about the old argument of accuracy versus fluency? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is really important, I think, for teachers to understand. And we often get this with trainee teachers, actually, when they're hearing mistakes, but they're not really sure whether to deal with it or not. Should they correct every single thing they hear? And I think this is where it's got to be really clear in the teacher's mind. What is the purpose of this activity? Is it to build on fluency? In which case, maybe let those go. If they're not the focal point of the activity, if they're not really central to what's going on, maybe it doesn't matter if they've made a few mistakes. If the focus is on communication skills and fluency. But then that said, obviously, there's a time and a place where you've taught them some particular language and you want them to put it into practice. And the whole reason for doing that task is to demonstrate that they understand what it means, how it's formed. So in that situation, then obviously error correction is going to feature more, because that's the intention of the activity. So I think teachers have to be really clear in their mind of what's the purpose of this activity, whether it's speaking or writing, and then maybe communicate that to students as well, because that
Yeah.
might have an impact on how they approach it. If they know that it's just about building their confidence in communication and fluency, maybe they'll be a bit more adventurous if they don't think they're going to get pulled up on every single error. So, yeah, I think that's quite an important consideration at the beginning of any language production task. So, Charlotte, what advice do you give to your trainee teachers when it comes to error correction?
Well, I think the most important thing to talk about with the trainee teachers and new teachers is to work on using a range of techniques. I think going back to my days when I first started teaching, I felt that if a student made an error, for example, I swimmed yesterday, and I said, "Oh, swam," and they say, "Oh, yes, teacher," I thought my job was done there. And I thought, I've corrected that. They know that's wrong. They know what the correct answer is, and we can all move on, and they'll never make that mistake again.
If
But
only.
actually, that's not the case. And I think it's really important to use a range of techniques and to make sure they're really student-centered. So, you can consider things like writing it up on the board, underlining where the error is, asking your students, where have we gone wrong here? Is there an error? Can you help me work it out? Let's see where this is not quite right. You can perhaps, ask your students if you want to use a bit of meta language, if you think that's appropriate. The verb, is the verb right here? Have we got, something going on there? And just, use a range of techniques. Always throw it back to them. We've talked about
Yeah.
it, with our activities and how we can make our activities fun and student-centered. And I think with our error correction as well, it's important to use a range of different techniques. So I've mentioned a couple there, Abby. Are there any more that you'd like to mention?
Well, I think it's interesting as well. We haven't talked a lot about that difference between errors and slips, and
Yeah.
and I think understanding that there are times where a student knows what it should be. It was just in the moment, they weren't thinking or they got it wrong. And there's so much that can be corrected by the student just with a really slight prompt. So just a little, maybe even just a little look, a raised eyebrow or a
Yeah.
think about that, you know, that can be enough sometimes.
Mm.
So, and yeah, I think you're absolutely right about making the students part of that process, because the number of times I've seen teachers correct by just spitting out the correct version of what a student has just said. And then they seem thoroughly confused when the student keeps making that same mistake. So if they
Yeah.
haven't had the chance to think through it, work through it, put it right, then I think they're unlikely to remember that correction going forward. So all of those
Mm.
student-centered techniques, I think, are great. Sometimes as well, the finger correction, where if
Oh,
you know
yes.
you've got a sentence with 5 words and you hold up 5 fingers, one for each word, and you kind of waggle the one that's got an issue with it, and they go,
Yeah.
"Oh, third word in. What was the problem with that one?" So again,
Mm.
lots of little prompts, I think, to get students reflecting and working it out.
And I think it's also important to let our new teachers know they don't need to be embarrassed, that students might feel embarrassed, and we don't just need to do that. Oh, well, I'll quickly correct that and we'll move on because that might be a bit embarrassing for them.
Yeah,
And actually, like we've talked about this whole podcast, sort of embracing it all, creating that environment where, oh, do you know what? It's not embarrassing. It's not a failure. It's just, hang on a minute, we've got a learning moment here that we can all benefit from. So I think
yeah.
that's quite important as well.
And you make that point about something we can all benefit from. You can guarantee if one student has made an error, they won't be the only one in that room that would
Yeah.
have got that wrong. So I think it's easy to think, oh, this is just one error that affects one person. But
Mm,
often it's not. It's something that others in the room will go, oh, I often make that mistake. Yeah, I get confused with that verb. Is it
yeah,
regular or is it irregular? So there's always going to be things that other people can learn from that mistake if it's dealt with well as well.
that is so true. And Abby, what about the quantity of error correction that you encourage your trainee teachers to do?
Yeah, so we talk a lot on our teacher training courses about basically that kind of thought process that goes through your head when you hear an error. So it's that decision making process of, first of all, what was the error? Because if you don't understand what it was yourself, then it's going to be a bit tricky to correct. And then understanding, do I need to correct this? So, what am I focusing on? Is it accuracy or is it fluency? And you may go, no, actually, I don't need to correct it. So that's fine. But if you decide, yes, it is quite important that this gets corrected, then the next question you're asking yourself is, well, when is the best time? Do I interrupt them and do it now? Maybe it's better to let this, you know, this conversation play out a little bit and we'll come back to it later, unless it's really affecting their intelligibility, in which case you might need to kind of intervene there and then.
Yeah,
And then you've got that whole question of, okay, so I've decided I do want to correct it. I've decided the time to correct it. Who's going to correct it? Am I going to put some examples on the board? Am I going to ask them a question? Do I think they can correct it themselves, or maybe someone else in the class could help them out? So I think it's kind of having this checklist in your head of that decision making process when it comes to correction, because we certainly don't want to be correcting every single thing that we hear that's
no,
not quite right. It's demotivating. It would take the whole lesson, quite
yeah,
frankly. And I think some trainees have a misconception that, you know, you're there to correct all errors. And in fact, that's totally not the case. I think as well, there's been some really interesting kind of things that I've read about getting some insights into how your learners feel about being corrected. We quite often make decisions on their behalf, like, oh, I don't think
mhm,
they like being corrected, or this student, they don't care, they're always shouting stuff out. But maybe get them involved in a conversation about it. And I remember reading an article about getting students to use coloured cups or rods or coloured anything, paper clips, to indicate how they felt about error correction on that particular day and in that particular activity. So, not generally. So, it might be that a student is thinking, I'm pretty tired today. My mind's not really on this. Didn't sleep particularly well. I'm not producing my best work. So please don't correct me every time I make a mistake. And they could indicate that by choosing, I think they did like a traffic light system. So an
oh yeah,
orange one meant if it's a major mistake, correct me, but otherwise let it go. So again, there's all sorts of things there about try and find out how your students are feeling. They might surprise you. You might find that some of your assumptions weren't quite what you expected.
That's a great idea. I'll have to try that one out myself.
Let me know how it goes. I think finally, we've mentioned it throughout, but again, it's coming back to that idea for trainee teachers. Make your students want to come back tomorrow. If they feel bad, or if they feel exposed, or if they feel like they're being overly corrected, that's going to have a really negative impact on their feeling coming into class, the next day or the next week. So don't forget to praise them for all the good stuff. I think it's very easy for us to identify the errors and kind of jump on them and go, oh, I'm a teacher. This is my job to correct those things. But that's got to be balanced with all the positive praise and feedback for all the great stuff that they're doing, which quite often gets overlooked. Something that could be quite simple could be quite a big deal for them, and we skim over that and go, what about that mistake? So I think just making sure it's a comfortable learning environment, it's a safe learning environment, and students are getting as much, if not more, praise for what they're doing than they are getting, errors corrected. So it's all about balance at the end of the day, isn't it?
And there's so much for our new teachers to think about. But I think with time, this all becomes second nature. So I think at first you might think, oh God, I've got to think about this, I've got to think that, and how am I going to do it? And who's going to do it? And I don't know if I should correct it or not. And it can seem quite overwhelming. But I think these are all things that take time, and you incorporate them in. And after a while, you're just doing it naturally without even thinking about it.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Yeah, it does. Suddenly you realise you've gone through a whole lesson and you've been doing it and you weren't even aware that you were. In this podcast, we reference Honey and Mumford's theory on learning styles. You might want to check this out to find out more about the 4 types of learner they focus on: the activist, theorist, pragmatist, and reflector. We also talked about a great student-centred activity called the Mistakes Maze, and you can find this in Bartram and Walton's book called Correction. And if you'd like to look more into that decision-making process around correcting errors in class, have a read of a whole chapter dedicated to this in Jim Scrivener's book, Learning Teaching.
If you would like some tips on how to generate more positivity in the classroom around the topic of making language errors, click on the link for our free downloadable article.
And did you know that we also have a language module on this topic? Go to our website to check out our bite-sized language modules focusing on practical classroom phrases and teaching tips on a range of topics.
Thanks for listening to this My World of ELT podcast, and see you next time.
Bye.